and facilitated by a committee of students and staff. The seminar is community sourced, and we're always accepting suggestions for future speakers, and you can email biomes.yse@yale.edu to suggest some speakers for next semester. This semester, we have the pleasure of bringing on Yale faculty to speak about their work and connect with students outside of class. So there'll be a quick Q&A after the seminar today. If you're on Zoom, just type your question into the Q&A box and someone will come ask your question for you. And if you're in person, just raise your hand and someone will bring a microphone to you. Pat has also said he's open to questions throughout his seminar. So if you have a question during his talk, just raise your hand and someone will bring a microphone to you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Pat Gonzales Rogers, who will be speaking about his work today. Pat is a distinguished practitioner in residence at the Yale Center for Environmental Justice and lecturer at both the Yale School of the Environment and the Yale School of Divinity. He has a long history of working with tribes to advance justice-centric conservation policies. Prior to coming to Yale, Pat served as the executive director of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition and the senior tribal policy advisor at the EPA. He also serves on the board of the America the Beautiful for All Coalition and the Windward Fund. Please join me in welcoming Pat.
Welcome all. Afio mai talofa fa'afeitai telelafa. In my own native tongue, Samoan, I welcome, say hello, and I really appreciate you for this opportunity. Often, just to kind of create a rapport, but mostly to soothe my nerves, I start off with a dad joke. Today's dad joke goes like this. What do you call a fake noodle from Boston? An effing and pasta. All right. So, today's talk is something for me that is fairly kind of seamless. When we talk about working with Native communities, and I'm borrowing it from a speaker that we had just earlier today in my class, Wizapan Garrett, who's 83 Yale grad, not 83, 2003, who's at the Department of Interior as an assistant secretary. He said, basically, all endeavors in Indian country with the land are the advancement of conservation. And I really want to borrow that because in the reality of it, that is what my sensibility is towards this topic. But in order for us to really engage on this, I do want to kind of give us some background on how did we get here, because the state of the nation, if you will, within Indian country has been promulgated from something long ago, and it is still with us. It is not just history, it is Indian law and policy as it is today, but it's from events of 700 years ago. And so I start off this conversation talking about the doctrine of discovery. So the doctrine of discovery, for those of you that don't have a background, was created in the late 1400s. And it really had this effect that we currently have to live with, as well as most indigenous communities globally. And so what we got to know about this period in time is that it was an incredible time of some advancement, right? So the compass became much more accurate. Ships had a really kind of portable usage, and now they could do voyages that lasted 2 to 3 years. This also came with the mercantile interest of basically Spain at the time, which was arguably the most powerful country in the world. And one of the reasons was the feature and affectation that they did not have an insulation between secular and non-secular interests. It was the combination of the Catholic Church promoting both theology as well as the governance structure. And so the unification of those two powers, which we now typically think of being distinct and separate for really profound purposes, were one in the same. At this time, there were all kinds of stories coming about what was in the New World. And of course, they were experiencing trade with Asia and other kinds of countries, but the West was really largely unrealized. And so The thought was they were going to really advance the promotion of Catholicism with the underlying, and I would kind of actually posit, the more important theme of acquiring land. And so with the advancement of that, of both Catholicism, there was this underlying issue that we could capture a bunch of land and then advance our economic interests. So these things collided, and it became what we now know as Indian law and policy, not just in our country, but other countries. And so we start with these two guys. It's Alexander and Nicholas. Nicholas is the bald, really, I think he just came off a GQ shoot on this second one. So these two guys were really kind of fomenting this whole thought, right? And so, oops. All right. They started off with what's known as a papal bull. A papal bull is really analogous to what we could consider now as an executive order. It was a promulgation from the Pope, who was basically both the non-secular as well as the thought leader of the church. And so the first thing they did, and this is incredibly putative in effect, they just divided up the world. Imagine like you and I just like, oh, blah, 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 let's divide up like Yale. You get this half and I get this half. And that's what they did. So they split the world in half between Spain and Portugal. And so the two treaties are named Tordesillas and the, I take that back. So the Treaty of Tordesillas basically split the world, and it's the reason why from the really kind of eastern corridor of South America, from Brazil all the way through Macau, we speak Portuguese, and then the other half of the world, we speak Spanish. So they split the world in half and say, these will be your particular territories, if you will. So go out and advance the world of the Catholic Church. And so they did it through this papal bull. The papal bull is really named after the kind of, they put a signature stamp at the bottom, which was a bull. And this is the actual papal bull. And so the other thing that came about this is not only did they separate the world for colonization, they also then gave formal kind of endorsement of slavery. So hence, I made up this term, a twofer of really kind of heinous public policy. So now they're splitting up the world. They're also endorsing kind of slavery. And so you can see where the world was kind of globally split up. And then the other treaty that I was struggling to think of was the Treaty of Saragossa, which was the Portuguese jurisdiction. So now you have this kind of visual that the world is kind of split up. And then the elements of the doctrine really kind of come out. So as they were advancing it, they basically said, if we discover the land and we don't think you are utilizing it in an appropriate manner, directly to our sensibilities of Western Europe, we could then just declare the land flaccid, basically. And this term that we're going to see is called terra nullius. But so they split up the world, and the two components or the two basic populations that were most affected were both native and agrarian. And so in many instances, one and the same. So you got native people and agrarian societies being affected by this kind of, this global colonization. And so the elements to this were, the first one there, first discovery. The next was at some point right after discovery, you have to actually occupy. Then these elements, which we're going to bring into a contemporary context, are next. Preemption of European title. And what does that mean? It means regardless of who you are, where you are, my action, the dynamic of discovery, preempts your title. I now am the legal owner. And what does that mean? It creates what is known as native title. Native title really means, all right, they kind of give you some like street cred, like, all right, you were here first, in some instances from time immemorial, right? But because you were occupying the land, I'm going to allow you to occupy the land. However, it means you don't have any ability to negotiate, i.e. you don't have fee simple title. So I discover the land, I preempt your title, and I subordinate you. And this is a common theme to all Native law and policy as we speak. And so the fifth point about limiting sovereignty and commercial rights, what it is saying is, because you no longer have fee simple, you no longer have this ability to negotiate on your behalf. And in fact, if you want to do anything with the land, with another party, you got to come to us first. And so this is still how Native lands are held in America. It is the reason why we have what's called the federal trust relationship, and it's also the reason for many of you in this world, your single biggest asset, as you might already have, or as you kind of get a little older, will be your home and property. And from that, you can do what's called debt financing. You can take out a second mortgage. You can leverage your property to buy other things. Tribes have never had that most basic element of what I think is a portable kind of financial and economic function because they don't own the land. The sixth point, continuity, is a really interesting and really goes within the themes of being putative and effect. So if you had some, imagine if you had some British people that discovered Albany, I'm just making up, and then you had another entity, say the French, that discovered Montreal. Continuity means you just split the difference. So whatever the difference between the other discoverer and the second discoverer, you just kind of half it in that continuity of those properties. So imagine this. You're saying, all right, let's come to some common sense agreement, but only with another colonizer, with another discoverer, and then screw the interests of the native people that live in between these two destinations. The seventh point I've already kind of referred to. So terra nullius means at the point of discovery, your land has no worth because you are not utilizing it relative to the precepts and sensibilities of the discovering country. And so it almost axiomatically renders the land useless per their definition of what land should be used for. And so then the other components are Christianity, of course, Catholicism, the advance of what they think is the best and newest kind of concept of civilization, cities, and then relative to all of this is the ubiquitous nature of violence, conquest. In all of these elements is always violence. And so right there, you have this kind of characterization that lives with us today. And so I'm going to take this a little forward so we have some context. These then are reflected in a series of court cases. And so our Constitution already makes some reference to this. And so through the Commerce Clause, there's a passage that the United States has jurisdiction over all issues of commerce relative to Indian country. And so you got to kind of think about, we're a burgeoning nation, we don't have a lot of precedents. And so roughly about 40 years later, in 1829, the cases end, but they're kind of sandwiched between a case in 1823 and 1832, and so they called them Marshall Trilogy. And these three cases basically really spell out what we now know as contemporary Indian law. The first one is not that bad. I'm not going to go into the fact pattern of the case, but it was a real estate transaction in which the state was trying to operate on behalf of the tribe. And what the court said is, states are distinct from tribes, and that there are really, think about it, three sovereigns. There's the federal government sitting on the top, and then two kind of comparable sovereigns, states and tribes, And to that, states cannot inform tribes of what to do. They are inherently sovereign, but they are in a subordinated status of their sovereignty. And much of the descriptors and adjectives really kind of describe a parent to child, an issue of competency, that tribes are not in the position to make their own decisions, and thus the US government must serve as a fiduciary, really kind of demarcating that subordination that you're down here, we're up here, and you can't really make decisions for yourself. So you got to check with us anytime something significant occurs. The other portion of that was your lands are not your own. They are inherently held in trust for you by the federal government, and that we have, again, this fiduciary relationship. So the three elements come into really plain view. And these are the three elements that we live with now, that tribes are sovereign, but it's a subordinated sovereignty. So they have to answer to the federal government. The federal government extends a fiduciary to tribes, and then tribes don't have any fee interest in their lands. These lands are held in trust, and that ultimately the federal government makes the ultimate decision-making to the utilization of lands. So I'll kind of wrap up this portion. I just wanted to give you a sense of this is what we're kind of living with right now. So this sets up this kind of underpinning, right, for a westward expansion. And at the time, this great friend to Indian country, Andrew Jackson, starts kind of advancing this thought because they see that the natural resources of the U.S. really extend in this vastness, which is the West. And so he starts making assumptions and insinuations that tribes would readily go along with this, and that this is going to be a fairly easy lift to get Native people to move westward. I do love this, like one passage that we talk about in my class. What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages? I don't know, the Yale School of Environment, to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute. Think about this. Like, what the F? Like, who are you to say what is within the sensibility and what people will enjoy? But this assumption of this, I don't even want to call it Judeo-Christian because that has nothing to do with the Judeo. It's with this culturally Christian sensibility that any person of their right mind wouldn't want to live in some natural, pristine environment. They would want to be in a crowded city and expose themselves to tuberculosis, syphilis, and typhoid. That's what we really want to offer to you. And so they create this movement as well as a narrative to move out west. And so this starts, which is really tethered to manifest destiny, this westward migration, and then the treaty period. And so I'll leave it at that. I think, at this point, we have a context to how we're living now. And when I say we, Native people are living under this particular kind of hierarchy of paternalism, and now they are separated from their lands. The thing that kind of amazes me now is even in really kind of, I think, straightforward scenarios, we still see this kind of interplay really intersecting against our public policy and what we're doing. And so think about, I saw some recent numbers on climate change. And so right now, I think there's about $8 to $9 billion on the streets for climate change. Now think about this other side of it. And what you got to know is, when I think about Native law and policy and justice of issues of environmental justice, I always view it more from pragmatism than historical attribution. So, speaking within pragmatism, Indian country is about 100 million acres. That includes Alaska Natives and tribes in the lower 48. Public lands, as you know, are 99% west of the Mississippi, and it is about 600 million acres. So you have 1/6 of all public lands are under the management of tribes. Now, to climate change, we also know that the general population is about, of color, 38 to 40%, right? And so of those dollars of climate change, do you know how much dollars go to Native and BIPOC groups of that 8 billion? Less than 1%. Less than 1%. All the empirical evidence also shows these same communities from a geographic region, especially those in arid communities in the Southwest, as well as other communities that are poor, indigent, and of color, suffer the bulk of climate degradation and environmental impacts. Notwithstanding, look at the incredible, inequitable kind of ratio of dollars that we put to these communities. And so really what I want to kind of talk about is all kinds of endeavors that we advance, yes, in Indian countries, but also BIPOC communities, are the advancement inherently of environmental justice. So any activity really puts this forward. The other portion of this is we have come, and this is just my personal perspective of working in conservation and the environment, and I would say probably 85, 90% of my work in the last 30 years has been inherently to Native communities, is this sensibility from traditional conservation. It is based, and you probably have had classes on it, on an incredibly paternalistic model that has been rationalized because it operates from benevolence. And benevolence that is also seated in the same form of institutional racism. And so too often, traditional conservation has also utilized science as the anvil to put on people of color, to say, we know better. And I go back to the first example about this inequitable kind of ratio of funding. Many of the groups, and I say this because I'm on the board of a funding group called the Windward Fund. I think last year we probably signed off on about $650 to $700 million, primarily on climate change projects. Whenever it's in advance that we have some new technology, a new innovation, we have an insert or a nexus to Silicon Valley, people lose their effing blank. And they think it's just the greatest thing. But you know what we do to communities of color? We create an incredibly complex set of analytics and metrics to a group that is usually 10 people and less, and then say, without explanation, you will utilize this in order to receive funding and report back to us. You know what metrics are? It's Snoopy's damn whoopee blanket. It only makes funders feel good. It has nothing to do with the inherent function of these groups. But so while we're kind of putting this draconian kind of paradigm on BIPOC and Native groups, meanwhile, if some new guy from Silicon Valley, some tech bro says, I have some technology that's unproven, I want to grant for $1.3 million, we sign off swimmingly without any kinds of repercussions. And so there's a sensibility that is built into this system that advances science. And I'm not saying I'm anti-science. What I'm saying is these things, instead of being bifurcated, science versus Native and traditional, really should be looked at in tandem. And so much of the sensibility towards these kinds of topics lack the information and the instruction of the very communities that are affected. And so we are now in this situation of regaining our spot. And I've kind of said this before, but it is kind of almost my mantra. Unless the communities that are most affected are not just solicited at the table, because we've gone beyond that. they have to be the primary integer to the calculus of their own decision-making and problem-solving. This subordinated relationship that we have with conservation and philanthropy, and then getting an afterthought opinion of the most affected group, is total BS. And in fact, I don't think of any other dynamic when you had the primary demographic affected and they are not part of the problem solving. And so that is where we are now. I think the national discourse and the momentum that we have gained through the last 2 to 3 years has been a game changer in terms of what our sensibility, but also what is our education and our realization of the history behind this. And third, I think the most important, by doing this, we can really create a different patina and a more robust outcomes on our respective deliverables that we have to any organizations that we work for. You know what I tell my class is, for any organization I work for, I will always kind of align myself to them. Otherwise, I wouldn't work for them. But I don't need your mission statement. Your mission statement is an institutional fabrication that you've kind of created to make everyone feel good and provide some direction. Myself, I don't need direction. I operate from my own cultural precept that was given to me at a young age. It is a Polynesian one. The first concept is called kuleana. It is responsibility. But responsibility, the other part of the definition of that in Native Hawaiian, is privilege. When you are in the responsible position, you're in the privilege, and so you carry it out. It also means we don't have to have necessarily big titles. It means that in every space of the community, there is a responsibility. So whether you're needed at Yale or another organization down the road or back to your neighborhood, you have kuleana, you have responsibility, but to think about it as a privilege. The other portion of that, which is really kind of essential to all of my work, is to operate with malama, that is with care, and then pono, integrity. So it really kind of centers me in back of how I'm doing things. The last portion that I'll say about this is, and I urge you to kind of think about it in these ways and within the kind of space of environmental justice is, and there's all kinds of terms that we use in various Native communities. For Lakota, they call it Ikse Wishkasha. And in Hawaiian, it's Maka'anana. In Samoan, Lautele, it's the common person. In all things we do, we need to have a relation to the community that we work for and the sensibility of the common person. And in this way, we invoke and we advance humility to our work. Too often, I think we are conflated, whether it's a big organization or the prestige of Yale, but what you're really doing it is for that common person. And so I think we can take really sometimes sophisticated ideas, but we need to have a directional on who this relates to and how it affects them and how they feel about it. And so in many ways, and I don't mean this to be self-deprecating because I'm not a tremendously humble person, it is to extend that humility is part of the work for us. And it really allows us to have both institutional and individualized empathy for those people that we work with. That empathy will also then naturally and organically bleed into a discourse. I think the other portion that I think about in which we can all do a better job is not to vilify the other side. It is to really spend the bulk of your energies as well as assets relative to those things we find in common and can advance. I think, the bifurcation of I don't like this and then I excommunicate is detrimental to all of us. At the end of the day, we rarely amputate things. It is the last measure. But we as a society, we as a people, we as organizations have come into the fairly intellectually and morally kind of sloth-like task of saying, I don't like what you're doing, and now I'm not going to work with you. All of our endeavors really should be the extension and the expansion of the boundaries that we work with to bring in more thought, a collective thought that really advances all of our kinds of objectives and missions. And this is environmental justice to me. The ability to leverage the thought and the history of these communities, but then to integrate it with other thoughts, whether that be with science or larger organizations or other communities. And so I will leave it at that. Any questions? I cannot express to you how much I've tried to economize my swearing. If you're in my class, there would have been 4 F-bombs and 3 MFs by now. So this, just in that, today has been a great success for me. Yes?
That's such a fine talk. Thank you so much. I wanted to draw you out a bit more with regard to community. Such a strong point that you're bringing forward, the voice of community in decision making. And I wanted to just put it in a larger scale for a moment and draw out your thinking. At this time, it seems as if we're also having contrary movements where we're questioning local communities with regard sometimes to justice, say, or health. Local communities opposing vaccines or so forth. So I wanted to draw you out. Do you see these currents of our time? We are pulling away from local communities at times, and now we're extending towards. So how do you see indigenous communities in these kind of movement of forces which might be counter to local voice in decision making?
Yeah, one of the questions that was kind of asked in my class the first day of class, and just for transparency, our first speaker of this semester was a person that worked for me. She was from the Bears Ears. She led our land management plan, and she gave this kind of question to the class, very open-ended. So what is the role or the particular status of homesteaders in Utah or / ranchers relative to the management of the Bears Ears? And I think, while we did not have some epiphany on this, we had a very frank conversation. And most of the conversation really centered around, this is a group that has been here for 5 or 6 generations, and they have a particular tie to the land. They have a particular narrative and sideboard. Now, does it rise to the same level of tribes who are, in some cases, from time immemorial, that have an ancestral kind of lineage that maybe spans 5,000 to 10,000 years relative to someone that's been there from, say, the 1880s? No, I mean, that would just kind of be ridiculous to say you're on the same level. That said, that voice still has to be listened to. That voice still has some truth. Now, I would say it's not definitive. It doesn't rule the day, but we need to go over and above the exercise of just listening and say all quarters, depending on, what side of the street you're standing on, have validity. And we are best served to think about it and what that means to that community. Because I go back to the ending point of my conversation. We cannot just vilify and stigmatize an individual or group. The whole kind of concept of tribal co-management, which is, where I come from, is about extending this tent and really navigating the legitimate and valid ideas that will create value added to the product that we're trying to deliver. And so it's kind of a roundabout answer, but essentially what I'm saying is, even in those parties that we don't agree a lot with, that doesn't mean that they don't have something to add to the conversation. And we need to give them voice. Otherwise, what we have done is vilify a party and then really give license to the idea that you should just be in a corner and not spoken to. And in reality, That's what we're suffering from as Native people. And so my thing is, we cannot replicate that same dynamic which we so loathe. We need to be exemplary in our ability to have a healthy discourse. And some of that discourse means saying no, but it also means I'm willing to say yes to some of what you've presented, and I'm always willing to listen. Yes.
Hi, my name is Faith. I just wanted to ask you quickly, how do you address anti-Blackness in your work? Because one thing that I grapple with is in the discussion of colonization, Black Americans are often never included in and seen as a colonized people, even though there's decades, hundreds of years of scholarship that draws that connection. And anti-Blackness is prevalent in a lot of BIPOC communities. So how do you combat that in your work? And how can the narrative around BIPOC Alliance be pro-Black as well?
Yeah, without being, tropish or monolithic, because I think all kind of communities have really distinct kinds of narratives as well as their own histories. I have an incredible kind of consideration to all communities of color, and especially to the Black community, given their history. Now, to that point that they're not colonized, I don't believe none of that BS. I mean, you can write whatever you want. I come from my own kind of, history where my grandparents were plantation workers, and it was a time when Hawaii was not a state. It means that my grandparents were chattel. They were actually owned by Dole Company. If they didn't show up to work, they could be jailed. Where they shopped was a kind of a really typical of that era is that the house that they bought was actually owned by Dole. The market that they shopped was owned by Dole. And so they never really had their own money. They were just using basically carnival script issued by Dole. And so, that particular experience really resonates with me. And so, my thing is that I like to operate, because so much of the things I've been involved with are really multi-layered, complex partnerships. And it is to say, by doing this, by having this particular precept, whether it is from the Black community or a Native community or my own kind of Samoan community, you will get a better product. And this has been tried and true already. And so the way that people look at land, and this is something I talk about in my class, is for Native people, we have a really distinct kind of relationship. There's a duality to the land. And so we don't think about, and this is especially ironic because this is a school of environment, we don't really adhere to many of the vernacular and lexicon, which is basically made up. A conservation easement, a wilderness area. And in fact, I would posit that these designations have actually had the opposite effect. If you look at peoples that say that can live next to a designated wilderness area, they're domestic oligarchs. These are the billionaires of Silicon Valley that have now migrated to Western Montana. And so I tend to kind of take that out of it and then bring it back to the kind of historical and cultural precept that everyone brings to the equation. In my instance, the land is an extension of me and vice versa. And so I don't look at it as a particular kind of thing to put in a parenthetical and manage. It supports me and I support it. And because of that duality, there is a seamless kind of identification that I have with myself and the land. Now, I'm not saying everyone adopt what I believe. What I'm saying is these principles, these kinds of sensibilities are portable and can create a better product for all of us. And so in many ways, it is to emphasize where you came from and what is important to you and create an intersectional kind of public policy relative to that. Does that answer your question? We all finished? Yes.
I'm trying to hold a thought in my head. I was really shocked. Yeah, sure. I'm trying to hold a thought in my head listening right now. I was really shocked when you pointed out that the tribes don't have fee simple ownership of land. The key bundle of the fee simple ownership stick is the ability to dispose of the land, right? But then the emphasis on community of removing the fee simple bundle, the fee simple stick, it basically removes the ability to, is removing that stick an element in community-based management, where you're taking off the ability for individuals to dispose of to subdivide and sell off the land. And I'm asking this because I've actually been very interested in tribal finance for a little while now, and thinking about how tribal governments can participate in bond markets and whatnot. And they do that reasonably successfully. And so I'm kind of trying to hold all these thoughts in my head of, I was really struck by the setup of losing that fee simple ownership and the emphasis on community management. And I'm wondering how to hold those two things in my head at once.
Well, you think about it this way. Typically, say I'm like 80% paid off on my house and I wanted to buy a Subway kind of distributorship. And I could easily then tap into and get a second mortgage on that, right? Tribes can't do that. And so think about it this way. What it really dictates is that you have to bring in a third party for financing. That third party takes an equity position in whatever the proposition is. And so they're starting from behind because we've created a dynamic. But it's not as kind of easy as that. One of the things I talk about is land back. But people are always surprised that in about 95% of the land back kinds of transactions that I know about, the land is always put back into federal trust. So people are like, what, they just bought the land, they're going to hold it in fee simple? Well, one, there's tax implications. If you have an adversarial relationship with the state, they could be punitive on those tax ramifications. Two, sovereign immunity attaches to all lands put into trust on behalf of tribes. Three, there's also then a conflation to the federal resources to the management of those lands once they're put into trust. And so now we've created this kind of political volleyball, if you will, that tribes are kind of used to it. Now, it's certainly not perfect, but also, like most things in life, the predictable on the things that we can really manage become a premium, regardless if it's still punitive to their very kind of maintenance, operation, and fiscal health. And so I don't have an exact question for you, except to say that the system lends to this subordinated relationship because they don't have autonomy over these resources. And the only way, and I've had people that are really kind of not read or educated on this topic on, well, why do the tribes stay in that? It's not the tribe's call. Congress has plenary power over Indian country, and only Congress would have the ability to change the nature and features of the federal trust relationship. That said, I've seen conservative estimates on the natural resource, including, surface, subsurface, assets to what Indian country represents. It's in the trillions of dollars. The only three countries that are not part of the UN's Declaration Rights of Indigenous People, otherwise known as the DRIP, are the US, Canada, and New Zealand. It's also the three countries that have a conflated relationship as well as absorbing many of the benefits of this really kind of ancient concept at this point. So I don't know if that answers your question head on, but that's some of the sideboard to it. Yes.
I just want to first say thanks so much for your talk and just sharing all of your wisdom and perspectives with us. Had a question and just generally curious about your thoughts, not a discrete question, about what I feel is a trend in science that's pushing towards like large journal publication that tends to look at studies that cover massive spatial extents and thus over lots and lots of communities. And so wondering if you could share your thoughts on how do you empower communities in work, and is there even a way to empower communities in your work while doing these massive scale studies? So first off, is there a place for that in an environmental justice framework? And then if so, what does that process look like?
Yeah, so I kind of go back to like my philosophy on this, and I always bring this back to everything we do really comes back to the essence of a relationship, and hopefully a personal relationship. Because once you personalize it, you don't take these other parties as just figurative kinds of antagonists or the enemy. And so you kind of encapsulate it in a way that I need to be at least cordial to my neighbor on the other side of the fence, regardless that they have a mofo beagle barking all night. So you really have to then kind of equate it to that. But the bigger question is also to embrace, and I think this is just really critical in all of the things that we do, is to embrace conflict is not abuse. Conflict is a predicate to the discourse that is natural to all collaboration. I think we are caught in and emphasizing the conflict without the outcome in a way that is detrimental to all of us. And so I say this all the time. The folks that I have most conflict with are actually my proponents when I'm part of a coalition, because there's a natural assumption that we should always be unified and provide a kind of a optimistic and collective front. It is very easy to kind of really manage someone that is opposite from you, because they represent all of that kind of contrast to what you are not. And so I think at the end of the day, I kind of have this analogy that, my background is as a lawyer, and I've kind of talked to a bunch of like first years on how do you get through law school. And my first thing to tell them is accept that this will be hard and arduous, because by the acceptance, you will then gain liberation. And what I mean by that, you can enjoy the elements that are there and have an acceptance that this is going to be difficult. And it's very analogous to how we kind of have interfaces with communities that might be adversarial. I want to embrace the nature of the conflict, not for the essence of conflict, but moreover that I can have an interface and a kind of discourse in which I might learn something. And so it is also the attitude that you may have something to bring to the equation, and I am not on the complete defensive of my position or an offense to put you in the corner. And so much of this I think about in a way that we are a collective community. Some of us have more history than others. And in some instances, we do have to make historical attribution relative to the treatment of whole communities, or in some instances, societies. But because I accept that conflict is essential, and that conflict will actually give a new patina to the deliverable and outcome, it gives me more agency. And so I kind of simplify it, and maybe I do that as a rationalization for myself, but it tends to highlight collaboration and it de-incentivizes vilifying other parties. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an answer.
All right, I think that's all we have time for. So thank you so much, Pat, for this wonderful conversation.
What's that?